Why is it that in India we have a lot of politics, which is a lot of hot air, nothing else seems to come out of it? Where do we take all of this and put them together in a fashion that might make conceptual sense to all of us? In my view, we have to begin at the beginning, and that is we must separate ethics from morality. I suppose some of the questions that have been raised and the puzzles that confront us are because we do not separate the two and they have to be analytically distinguished. Morality is something which is a private affair. You can privatize morality. You can say that I'm a vegetarian and all these carnivores around me, but still I'm a vegetarian, I shine in the midst of these sinful people. But you cannot be ethical alone. Ethics is all about other people, whereas morality in its truest sense can be privatized. And because morality can be privatized, therefore morality can also work at cross purposes. For example, I can be a good son, a good brother, but a bad husband because I team up with my good mother in beating up my wife. Now all of this is, by the way, contradictions within the realm of morality. But they're all privatized. I don't take my wife into consideration while I'm framing rules of morality for myself. I might also say that you caught me with my hand in the till, but I'm using this money as a good father to give my son an education or to marry off my daughter. So there again, you have conflicting moral values, and there doesn't seem to be a way out. The way out is through ethics. Ethics is other people. Very often we tend to conflate the two, ethics and morality, and that is why we have a great degree of difficulty in sorting out certain basic problems. Now, when we talk about ethics, and I said to you earlier, ethics is about other people, morality is about ourselves. And that is why Indian thinking and even Western philosophy till about Kant was all about yourself and how you will improve yourself, how do you get to know yourself, what are the categories of cognition, and so on and so forth. And I believe that from the 19th century onwards, right up to today, the reason why Western philosophy has been a breakthrough and does not resemble even remotely its ancestors or cognate philosophy in different parts of the world is because in Western philosophy from the time of Hegel right down to today, they're talking about other people. Philosophy is about other people, self and other. And that is the dominant concern in all Western thinking. And believe it or not, we have to take it on board as well, because the moment we talk about other people, we talk about ethics. Ethics, therefore, is not about the self, it's about others, and therefore it enjoins upon us to think in terms of teamwork and citizenship. Because, as I told you earlier, you can't be ethical alone. Dr. Samuel Paul mentioned traffic rules. Traffic rules may sound trivial to you, but as a matter of fact, is a very good and profound example of ethics. If you observe traffic rules, all of us get the job done better. But if you don't observe traffic rules, some of us might seek through, but the bulk of us will fall behind. The other thing about ethics is that all the rules of the game are out there in the open, allowing for very little room for negotiations and interpretations. For example, I would say that sport is a very good example of ethics after traffic rules. Because in sport, the rules are known to everybody, the players, the referees, the audience, and the mass media. They all know what the rules are. And you, by the way, have to excel by playing according to the rules. And that is what I think Ms. Meena Ganesh meant about excellence in corporate life. You excel by playing according to the rules. Otherwise, you can't excel at all. Poranja mentioned a ditty. Let me mention another ditty to you. It's a ditty which is, which tells you about the spoiled brats of the Kennedy clan. The most spoiled, I'm told, was the middle brother, Bobby Kennedy, and the ditty goes like this. Bobby played football, Robert Kennedy. Bobby played football, Bobby lost but would not yield, for Bobby said, what the heck, I own this football field. Now, if that is the way in which you're going to excel, then you won't really excel at all. Why is it that Michael Jordan can jump 3 feet or whatever, stay straight for a nanosecond and go 6 inches again in the air? It's because he is excelling according to the rules of the game, and therefore he is making a difference. That is professional excellence when you play according to the rules. When there are no rules, you don't have professional excellence. Professional excellence always comes with rules, and where the levels of interpretation of rules are minimal. In a moral situation, the rules are always implicit. Nobody really knows what the rules are. Should I be a good father, good husband, good son, good neighbor? Not very clear. So I make up my mind depending upon the situation, the context, which is why very often people say that Hindu law is more contextual than textual. Depending upon the situation, I take a stand because I'm being a moral person. A moral person, for example, in a business house would be the tycoon. The tycoon is a moral person because he stands above others and he shames you by his inordinate charisma. He's a chest-thumping, cigar-chomping hero, and all of you are in his shade. But in a modern corporate organization, and all of you know about it, in a modern corporate organization, that kind of tycoon would not last. That kind of tycoon will not wash in a modern situation where you actually need team leaders. A team leader, by the way, is not always the best batsman in the team or the best bowler in the team. The team leader is a person who can get the best out of the team, which is why Hansie Cronje was supposed to be a model captain in South African cricket, not because he was a great cricketer himself, but because he brought out the best in his players. And that is the meaning of ethics, and that is the meaning of teamwork. And that, incidentally, is also the meaning of citizenship. Citizenship has been interpreted in a number of ways, and now with all the agitation going around, there are a few more ideas up in the air. But basically, citizenship, according to Marshall, who I think is one of the foremost thinkers on the subject, citizenship grants a status of equality to everybody, on the basis of which structures of inequality can be built. So you must first and foremost grant equality to everybody according to the rules of the game, so that each may excel according to his or her predilections and talents. And that, I think, is the ultimate element of citizenship, which also is in continuity with what is ethics. So when we ask the question, why are we so tolerant of corruption? We're tolerant because we can't really make up our minds between morality and ethics. And that is the big puzzle we have. We keep thinking this is also moral and that's also moral, but it's not. One is moral, the other is ethical. One is personalized, the other is the other. One is about the self, and ethics is about teamwork. One is about the tycoon, the other is about the captain. One is about professional excellence, the other is about individual aggrandizement. And this is the dilemma that all of us face. Incidentally, we are all human beings after all. Morality works best in the region of kin, clan, family, community, neighborhood, friendship. Morality works best about personal relations. Ethics doesn't work very well in those situations. For example, if I were to come to your house, my car has sort of broken down, it's raining, I come to your home, you feed me, you dry my clothes, you let me sleep the night over and leave the next morning, and you don't present me with a bill. That's because you're my friend. And that later on, at some point, at an unmentioned date, perhaps I will return this gratitude with interest, but that is all in the realm of perhaps. But when you talk about ethics, it's a professional conduct that has to be entertained right there. So what you expect should be known in advance, which is why in an ethical situation, you do not trust people. You trust individuals. You don't trust, in an ethical situation, you don't trust people, you trust institutions. Institutions are more important than people. So if I go to a bank and the bank manager knows me and he gives me a loan, worry about that bank. That bank is not an ethical bank. It may be a very good bank, it may be very large-hearted, but that's not the right kind of bank to have. That's not an ethical institution. An ethical institution where institutions matter more than individuals, and this is why I feel that when we talk about ethics in business, it is not as if either ethics or let's do well in business. It's not as if because it's ethical, I have one arm tied behind my back and I'm functioning with a handicap. Believe me, when I began this division in the KPMG, which has already been referred to earlier, it was seen as a bit of a joke. Ethics and business in India, oxymoron, are you crazy? But we did well. Not only did we do well, I must also tell you, more than half my clients were actually Indian companies. And they showed a great deal of interest in it because we said time and time again, that ethics is not something you do after you make the money. Ethics is something you do because you want to make money. Ethics is the way of making money, and if you want to be a marathon runner, be ethical, and it will yield returns. For example, let's take the issue of corporate governance, about which all of us are so exercised about. Corporate governance is often sublated with corporate philanthropy. There again, you see a clear-cut, a confusion between morality and ethics. Corporate philanthropy is morality all the way. I get up in the morning, I look out the window, I find some poor children, I give out a whole lot of money and say, feed them, school them, clothe them, house them. And I'm the CEO of the company. Tomorrow somebody else comes up who's the CEO of the company, he looks out the window and sees women, and in desperate condition, he starts an NGO for women. So this is exactly what morality would inspire us to do. When it comes to corporate social responsibility from an ethical standpoint, it is very, very different. You start with what is happening at home. You start from your backyard. You start from your company. And you radiate outwards to society from your company so that your company profits at the end of the day. It's a business deal. It's a business model. You don't put your C team on the job, you put your A team on the job if you want to do CSR. And I believe CSR can be three-pronged, for example. It can be consumer-oriented, competence-oriented, or community-oriented. But all these three orientations, at the end of the day, it should benefit your company. You reach out to the society, so at the end of the day, the society benefits and you benefit too, and that is what I think is a proper ethical way of going about CSR. Not caring about digging wells or setting up soup kitchens and so forth. There are, of course, advantages that we have living in a democracy. And the advantage is that though some of the most striking advances in democracy have happened in the streets, not in parliament, not in the Senate. You think of some of the most important advances in democracy, let's say the right to vote, for women's right to vote, right to adult franchise, or civil rights. All these three major inputs in democracy did not come from the institutions of democracy as such, but came from a wider understanding of democracy from the streets, pressure of the streets, not for 1 day or 2 days or 1 year, 2 years, sometimes for decades. The good thing about democracy is that eventually democracy listens. And this is what we must actually doff our hat to and pay tribute to democracy for. Today, why are we talking about all of this corruption issues so much? Why is there such a problem with us today? It's a problem with us today because we see an ethical mismatch between what we were told democracy is about and what it is actually in practice. In the past, we were spending most of our energies in establishing democracy, in undermining feudalism, other forms of pre-democratic structures. So we were caught up in that. Now that we've established democracy, now that we're comfortable about it, now that we're no longer worried really about feudalism or slavery coming back, we're looking closely at democracy because now we're not fighting for democracy, we're living with democracy. It's like health. Today, more and more people live with illness, lifestyle diseases. Earlier, we died of heart attacks, we died of cancer, but now we don't die, we live with them. And because we live with them, we tend to question the doctors more closely. Likewise, because now we are living with democracy, we tend to question democracy more closely. And what you see in Wall Street takeover or in India or anywhere else in the world, it is really this. It is the ethical economy of democracy that is being questioned. And that is why we should actually welcome all of this. Because I think democracy is coming of age, a new era has begun. But this can actually be taken forward in a meaningful fashion if we separate ethics from morality. And remember, we're always in this dilemma. Should I give this person a job because this person is my cousin? Or should I give the other person a job because that person is ethically qualified for it? And this dilemma is perpetually with us. This is why when Ms. Ganesh talked about the problems of corporate world, this is exactly it. It is always in shades of grey. Had it been black and white, no problem at all. It's because in shades of grey, It's not illegal, by the way, to love your wife or your father or your husband, whatever, over and above your colleague. It's not illegal. But in different situations, different things become regnant. Therefore, you're constantly in a situation of dilemma. Dilemma is a human condition. And therefore, to be able to actually work your way through this dilemma or series of dilemmas, you have to practice, practice, practice. Correct, correct, correct. Practice, practice, practice. Which is why in my years in KPMG, in the division of ethics and forensic accounting, I kept insisting to my clients, you have to practice all the time. And any rule that is good for the people in the office, the lowest staff, is also equally good for those at the top. You can't have two different sets of rules. One rule explicitly express minimum room for misinterpretation, and that is what ethics is about. So if we were to put in these canons in place, I think we'd be much better off. You know, the reason why this patron-client or tolerance for corruption comes about is because we are so uneven in our everyday life. This unevenness has to be bridged. When we talk about citizenship, giving everybody a status of equality upon which structures of inequality can be built, what does it mean? It means that people should have basic health, universal health, and universal education. Otherwise, if we do not build a middle-class society, where each of us are more or less the same, each of us can be intersubjective in our dispositions, that we can trade places, that I can look at you with empathy, not sympathy. Sympathy is moral. With empathy. I can look at you with empathy, understand you empathetically. When that happens, then the room for ethics grows. But how will that happen? It won't happen just like that. It happens because democracy also enjoins us to privilege and prize good leadership. And good leadership throughout the democratic world, throughout the history of democracy, whenever changes have taken place, has not come about because of the routine grinding and groaning of democracy. It's come about because certain leaders have stepped forward, taken initiative, and moved ahead. Everywhere, 19th century Britain, India, wherever you look, wherever democracy is done well, is because leadership has been to the fore. And wherever I find this leadership excelling is when they decide to set up institutions of universal health and education, and they dare the odds, they dare the opposition. When Sweden introduced Fockenheim program, Sweden was very, very poor in 1932. It was very poor in 1932. 1 million people left for America, they couldn't feed themselves. When Canada in 1942 thought of health program, it was very poor. 1946, when Britain thought about universal national health service, it was so poor, it couldn't hang on to India. It was under those circumstances that they said that we have to do this. This is the way by which we can become rich. We don't do this after we're rich. This is how we become rich. So I would say ethics is about other people. You give that respect to other people. You treat yourself, if you think you're a leader, as a captain, and you will find that ethics is also a very profitable enterprise. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Deepankar. I just want to ask one question to each one of you, and then I'll throw it open to the audience. First question I'd like to ask is to Paranjal. Meena talked about people getting shamed by their being exposed in the media and being essentially becoming a permanent part of the internet once your name has been exposed. But if I just look back, for example, here in Karnataka, the Lokayukt has been catching people for various acts of corruption for the last decade. And there are literally dozens of people from the state who have been named and shamed. Yet, I'm not really sure that has had a very visible impact on corruption. So, does this naming and shaming really work?
Naming and shaming would help up to a point, but you also need a certainty of punishment, which you again talk about the rule of law and the working of our criminal justice system. You can argue that if every cop was a criminal, you wouldn't have law and order. It's because perhaps there's 1 out of 99 cops, I'm exaggerating to make a point, who's not a criminal, that you have law and order. Or that 1 out of every 100 judges is honest, that you have justice. That 1 out of 100 journalists does not take a bribe, that you have freedom of expression. So naming and shaming helps, but there are people who have been named but not shamed. So to add to that transparency in society, you also need a certain amount of certainty in punishment. The fact is, there's been a huge debate in this country about whether the people who were put behind bars in the 2G's case, whether the right to bail was a fundamental right or the right to jail. But in the eyes of the public at large, the very fact that Mr. Raja has been behind bars in Tihar from the 2nd of February till now as we've talked is something which is significant, because in the eyes of many he has already been punished, even though that trial is still on. So there is something to do with perception and reality in this case. So the point is that, of course, it helps if you name and shame people, but what if those who are named are still not shamed? What then do you do?
Yeah, I'm sort of reminded about the hero's welcome that Kanimori got when she returned to Chennai recently.
Or that Sri Ramulu has become a member of parliament from Bellary with a whopping majority.
So Meena, you spoke a lot about how important it is to emphasize excellence within the organization, and that's one way the company or a business can be ethical. But how easy is it to emphasize excellence and focus on all that when you are seeing around you an environment where obviously many of those values are not shared in larger society?
See, like I said, whether it's a child looking up to the parent or a student looking up to the teacher, ultimately it's the leadership. Now, if the leadership is able to demonstrate and demand that excellence, that's the only way it gets done. So it is very easy for leaders to also start getting influenced by the environment and say, it's okay. But if a leader has the courage to say that irrespective of whatever happens, what I do has to be of the best quality, and I will provide the best customer service to my customers, irrespective of the fact that they get shoddy customer service from everybody else, and then it gives a much higher impetus. Now, along with that, of course, you have to have the systems and processes and all of that. But ultimately, in my mind, it's the leadership that's what can drive a behavior of that nature, especially when all the others around you are crumbling. To me, that's the only thing that can work.
Dipankar, in IIM, we've been having a lot of discussion about what we need to do as far as ethics education is concerned. And at various times in the history of our MBA program, we have either had formal courses on ethics, sometimes we've had workshops, sometimes we have faculty saying that the students are too old to be taught ethics at this point of time. And in any case, how do you really teach ethics? So, just given two things. One, the distinction you made between ethics and morality. And second, your experience in working with companies through KPMG and the ethics practice. What would you recommend to an institution such as ours on what we should be doing in the education process?
In brief, I'd say this, that ethics doesn't come easy, especially in our kind of situation where patron-client relationships are so tempting, where it is so easy to be moralistic. It's not something that happens naturally. Therefore, as I said to you earlier, one has to practice all the time. But if you're thinking of running an ethical organization and you want to make it a successful organization, not just ethical and losing jobs and losing money, you want it to be a successful and ethical organization, then I think the most important thing is to have rules which are laid out in the open, transparent, to which everybody subscribes, from top to bottom. I remember once I was advising a company in South India, a very large company, and we were talking ethics. It was going on fine, and then this gentleman who owns the company tells me at lunch that you see all those cars over there, they're all company cars, but in fact they're my cars. Now if you have that kind of attitude, you can't take ethics forward. Ethics is about stating the rules up front, being transparent about them, and constantly practicing on it. So you say, we don't allow nepotism. But very few people really understand what nepotism actually is in practice. You may say any number of very nice things on your board as you enter. We don't want child labor. But what does it really mean in practice, you don't quite know. Or minimum wages, overtime. These are the kinds of issues that have to be worked out again and again and again in consultation with your colleagues. There's one company which we worked with, and that company had to pay huge bribes to the government because the government was its primary customer. And it was creating all kinds of problems within the company in terms of cash flow, etc., etc. And you won't believe it, I'm again cutting a very long story short. Just by talking about it with his colleagues, the CEO of the company was able to make a big difference to the way in which the company was functioning. Bribery is another big problem, especially if you're looking for the sales department, if you're on the front end of the business world. There again, there are very many rules one can put in place. In fact, to be able to, reward the sales agent who pays the least bribe was one way by which we were able to actually inculcate a contrary thought within the business system. So if you were to really put an ethical thing in place, I would say, think of the workers, think of upgrading their talent, think of getting them giving them a kind of life that you would like yourself to lead, for example, and do all of this through practice, correction. This has to go on constantly every now and again. You can't just say, I'm ethical, that's it. And sometimes you must take very tough decisions. In 1905, if I'm not mistaken, or 6 perhaps, the old man Tata, and you will know about this perhaps, he invited Sidney and Beatrice Webb. Who would invite Sidney and Beatrice Webb? They were socialist and a bit of a joke in their own country. But he invited them, and they looked around Tata Steel, and they said that, our advice to you is start an 8-hour day, 8-hour shift. And so Tata said, okay, 8-hour shift. 8-hour shift began in Tata well before it began in England, well before, of course, in India. And did Tata lose? No, it won. It did very, very well. So ethics is something that actually helps you in the long run, but you have to keep practicing at it. You must go on and on, practicing and correcting, and you must have your rules which are explicit and which leave very little room for multiple interpretations.
So Paul, I'd like to ask you the same question I asked Deepankar. In the context like I am, I mean, you've been very much part of a similar look at these things from a broader societal perspective. What do you think we should be doing in our MBA program, for example, with regard to ethics education?
Very briefly, ethics or ethical choices that Deepankar explained are in a way straightforward, although there are areas of grey as he indicated. It is not that we are not aware of what is ethical, unethical. Very often that is not the issue. But the temptations are too strong to violate or to do things. So I would think in an educational setting or in teaching, particularly with more mature students, and it might apply for anyone, I think examples that will inspire and clarify issues is what I would go. That's a direction I would take rather than purely talking about abstract principles, because they are easily cited, I think. If we can get inspired and therefore we respond in a certain way in our own careers, in our practice, that will make an impact. How to do that? And when you go back to the methodology of case studies, for example, there's a little bit of that in that. You describe about what a leader did, how teams were brought about. I mean, the principles we may know, but how somebody did it in that context, what consequences then he faced, or what impacts he was able to make. All of that, I think, will stay with us longer and inspire us than pure statement of principles. So that I'm simply pointing to a direction.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, let's open up to the floor. We'd like to welcome some questions. Just a request, we have limited time, so please keep your questions very short and to the point. And I request you to avoid making long statements. Yes, please. Thank you.
This is actually a question for Professor Gupta. I'm right here. I think you're looking for me. My name is Vijay. I work at a quick service chain called Kati Zone in Bangalore. My question is, actually, I have two questions. One was you mentioned three-pronged approach to CSR. I was curious about that. But more importantly, you also mentioned that the two aspects important that we need to look at in society, that society needs to develop, or a nation needs to develop to progress ethically, I think. That's what I understood. One is universal health and the other was education. Education I completely understand because it helps you when we take places and moves us to a place where we can be empathetic with each other, and then it's no longer about morality, and then we can look at ethics. I didn't understand why you talked about universal health, because America, I think I'm not sure if even now you could say it has universal health, but I mean they passed Obamacare, but I'm not sure if that constitutes as universal health. I think of a lot of American institutions to be ethical, much more than us.
Okay, I think I got the question.
Okay.
Please keep on.
Okay, I'll go to CSR first. I mentioned three: community, competence, and consumer. Let me take the most difficult part: community. IKEA, you heard of IKEA? IKEA sources material from all kinds of places, including very backward districts of UP, Bhadoi, Jaunpur, Mirzapur, places like that. And their biggest problem is child labor, because now if somebody takes a photograph and puts it in the internet, your reputation is gone. It happened with Nike, for example, in Vietnam, So they had to take care of this. So how did they do it? They had auditors, of course. They employed a whole team of auditors. But I think the more fundamental move they made was that in the areas that they were working, they encouraged quality education for children. Premised on the fact, on the belief that parents want the best for their children, and should the children get good education, they put them in school rather than send them to work. And it was a great success. And for this job, it was not some small time at IKEA who was assigned the task. It was one of the most senior officials. And the president of IKEA would come time and time again to check on what was happening. So the amount of enthusiasm it generated. We talk competence, the entire thing of the IT sector, how the IT sector is spreading computer literacy is also good for them. Consumer, a certain chemical is not very good for you, but there's no law against it, but you decide not to use it anyway. And that raises the bar. So this is the way in which you do CSR, but you're also actually impacting upon your own factory or your own business very, very centrally. Now you come to university.